While driving through Petal, Mississippi one day, I saw a sign for hand-shaved snow cones. I stopped and ordered a silver fox. As the lady was making my order, I noticed she was shaping the ice of my snow cone with her hands. Her bare, unwashed hands. Hey everybody, and welcome to Second Acts Podcast. As Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, there are no second acts in American lives, but there are on Second Acts Podcast. This is episode number 6. I'm your host, Sean Riley. Our guest today is Rogan Russell Marshall, screenwriter of The Attic Expeditions and Freezer Burn. Back after this.
Do you enjoy being a fly on the wall, getting to listen in on a conversation and learning things about the people involved? Hi, I'm Rhett Hall, and I host the Brain Trust Brothers podcast, where every week I bring the audience along to listen in on a conversation between myself and someone that I find interesting. It could be another podcaster, an actor, or just some guy from down the street. You never know what you're going to get, but you can always count on it being fun, informative, and entertaining. You can find the podcast every Tuesday on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or by visiting braintrustbros.com/podcast. Join me as I try to make the world a better place, one conversation at a time.
For this episode of Second Acts, I was really jonesing to talk shop with the screenwriter. For whatever reason, screenwriters had proved to be the most difficult to make contact with. That's why, when Rogan Russell Marshall agreed to come on the show, I was absolutely thrilled. I actually met Rogan, briefly, as an undergraduate film student at the University of Mississippi through a mutual friend, an experience he probably doesn't remember. Rogan is the writer of 2001's The Attic Expeditions, starring Seth Green, Jeffrey Combs, and Alice Cooper, as well as 2005's Freezer Burn. While prepping for the show, I noticed that Rogan seemed to be going through some serious stuff on the home front. At several points along the way, I asked myself whether I was selfishly adding to his plate with this interview. I don't think Rogan would mind me sharing this, since he's a pretty candid guy, and he's shared some of these issues publicly on social media anyway. Rogan seemed to be in good spirits the night of our interview, and was a very patient and generous guest as he shared some great insight into the art and craft of screenwriting, as well as his experience with the Attic Expeditions. All the while, a serial killer was running loose on the streets of his neighborhood in Tampa. Somehow, that's just a fitting backdrop for a Rogan Russell Marshall interview. Rogan, if you're listening, hang in there, my friend. We're all looking forward to your next project. Is it true that you were never paid for the Attic Expeditions?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It was originally going to be a much lower budget movie than it ended up being. I think their final declared budget on paper is $1.2 million, but our original plan was we were going to make it independently, and I was going to play one of the leads myself. The director, Jeremy Kasten, was my best friend in college. We made some student films together at Emerson in 89, 90, 91. I also know the two lead producers from Emerson back in the college days, Dan Griffiths and Dan Gold. We planned to make Attic Expeditions for basically 10 years before it happened. I wrote the first draft in I think 91. And I wrote 7 or 8 drafts over the years. Pretty much every time Jeremy thought he had a shot at getting to direct something absurdly young and inexperienced, he'd want me to rewrite the script, polish it for a new producer, and so that was all spec work. I never got paid for any of that. When the movie finally did move forward, we never thrashed out a new agreement with pay that made sense with the expanded budget of the movie, and they didn't even pay me that. The original agreement was $7,500 to write it and star in it when it was going to be a $100,000 movie in toto. And the contract they sort of twisted my arm to make me sign was still only for $7,500 and 1% of the back end. And then when the movie was finished, came out and started bringing money in, they just quit speaking to me. All of them stopped returning my calls and started telling people I wasn't returning theirs. And to this day, I understand that if you ask any of those three guys about Rogan and where he is and why they haven't paid him, they'll tell you I'm insane and I've gone entirely off the grid, and they can't find me and they can't pay me. It doesn't really make sense. They have me blocked at Facebook. I haven't tried to sue them. I've been hoping that in the fullness of time, and given how small the filmmaking community is, and eventually I'll be working in Los Angeles again, hopefully, on one show or another, social pressures will force them to make things good with me. It's better than dragging it into court, wasting money and time on that.
Was the whole experience still worth it?
Yes. It's a bona fide third string cult classic that has sustaining interest. I'm a professional screenwriter who's that's sort of a hard bar to get over all around, being a professional screenwriter who can write stuff that SAG cast and crew can shoot. And that gave me the opportunity to do that. It certainly would have been better had I been paid. I didn't even get all the credits I was supposed to get. I directed a couple of B units. I worked in the art department. But all around, I think I'm ahead. I think if I was in a position where somebody told me they could arrange the limited prestige and publicity attendant on writing attic expeditions in return for a $7,500 payment, I probably would have said yes. So, but filmmaking, it's sort of like gambling all around, and making money in filmmaking is always tricky. The pride I can take in having written a small movie that broke even, given the state of the market, is worth something too. Whether or not I got my 1% of it. I think I came out ahead all around, though I'd rather get paid, and I sure wouldn't throw out the yellowed old contract I'm still holding on to, hoping it'll mean something someday.
Do you have a new perspective on the WGA after that experience on Addicts?
Well, I sort of foolishly went out of my way not to... First, I set out to only write screenplays for people I knew socially, which sort of made sense. I went to Emerson. I knew a bunch of aspiring young filmmakers who moved out to Los Angeles. But then I sort of bided my time because I wanted to be able to walk into an agency and tell them I had already qualified for guild work without having an agent, which just sort of doesn't happen. But unfortunately, my health went south in a big way right when I wrote the final of the 3 or 4 gigs that qualified me. And it all happened pretty quickly. Attic Expedition started making money. I think the same month my back problem got serious. And probably my back problem got serious because I had been working really hard at the computer trying to get ahead as a writer.
I think people downplay ergonomics, the importance of ergonomics in screenwriting, huh?
Yeah, I have to sit now in a very careful position with tennis balls propped against the what do you call it, trigger points. I have to do stretching exercises at intervals. Yeah, it's But when I was young, I probably hurt myself worse than most writers do. I was really into taking, I guess I could say broadly speaking, stimulants while I wrote. A lot of the drafts of Attic I wrote taking crystal meth or LSD, and I would sit and just write an entire draft without getting up for anything. sometimes 20, 30 hours at the computer, except for maybe 1 or 2 bathroom breaks. And I usually didn't have a decent desk during those days either. So these long hours hunched over a computer is not very good for your back. Not very good for your back.
Would you say that writers in general are a difficult bunch to live with?
Yeah, actually. I think that writers tend to be a certain kind of asshole. It's sort of like the way that cops tend to be bullies, the way that teachers tend to be sort of lecturing authoritarians. I think there's a cluster of personality issues that writers all have in lesser or greater degrees. Writers are definitely difficult people to deal with in certain pretty predictable ways. It's funny because Stephen King, he always uses writers for protagonists, and I always think, does he not know the rest of the world doesn't really like writers much? We're a little tricky to hang out with. Does he not know that? But maybe he's trying to apologize for it. Maybe that's what that was about.
Yeah. It is an interesting dichotomy when you watch a lot of these movies that come out, especially the romantic comedies, the Hallmark movies, and things like that, where your writer is a protagonist, and it's always depicted as a glamorous job to have. But in reality, I'm not a professional screenwriter by any means, but I've certainly spent my time writing and rewriting scripts that I've filmed. It's a very depressing, lonely life, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely lonely. When I talk to young writers who ask for advice, one of the things I usually say is don't even try to get into it unless you have personal reasons to enjoy or favor spending most of your time alone in a room. You work alone, and you can't even really discuss your work mostly with people. When you do, it's sort of like discussing your Dungeons and Dragons character. Only your fans really care. And I think that's kind of reflected in what writers write too. I think that the loneliness of the writer and the parallel loneliness of the reader or the viewer are always there, always present.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem with screenplays, isn't it? People don't want to read screenplays. People will read novels. They'll read short stories, but they don't want to read screenplays. So, there's the problem you mentioned is that you can't even share your work with loved ones because they don't want to read it. And half the time I can't blame it because I don't really want to read a screenplay either,
Yeah, I have trouble reading scripts entirely unless somebody's told me I'm going to act in it. Then I pay close attention. Well, and really good screenplay style in the descriptions tends to be pretty dry. It's sort of it's a secondary consideration whether it's a good read. But yeah, I mean the finished work isn't the screenplay. It's the movie. So mostly your work as a screenwriter is invisible, and you do a lot of work as a screenwriter too, which is literally invisible. That is, I've done several things where without credit I got paid to rewrite someone else's script that was good but not technically proficient, needed to be rewritten so it could be broken down and shot. And I think everyone who's a pro screenwriter has done a bunch of that kind of work. And you're not even really the writer when you're doing that kind of writing. It's you might as well be writing instructions for how to put together the furniture.
Yeah, it takes on a technical writing aspect, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's mostly technical writing. Actually, when I was young, I had to... Well, the process of learning screenwriting as a technical matter and storytelling is two different things. Screen storytelling or any storytelling is its own art or craft, and writing for the screen has the same relationship to a movie or a TV show as a blueprint does to a house. It's not at all art on its own. Only if it's actualized and produced and put on the screen. Yeah, it's never really your own work. I don't know. I'm sure there are screenplays that were written by writers who are expressing themselves in the way one sort of expects writers to seek to express themselves in their writing, but usually you're entirely focused on the needs of the investors, the needs of the producers and director, and the needs of the audience. your own taste in storytelling, the ideas you want to share are secondary. If that.
Do you think there's an aspect of psychotherapy going on, that screenwriters are working out their problems?
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's muted in screenwriting compared to other kinds of storytelling, because you end up filtered through endless feedback from 2 or 3 circles of producers and investors, actors, casting directors, hoops you have to jump through. So anything that is oddly personal or neurotic or doesn't jive with everyone's personal experience sort of tends to get ironed out of screenwriting. But still, I think the personal foibles and predilections and peculiarities of the people making a movie often come through, and unconsciously everybody knows that the cinema tends to be racist and sexist, and it's become a topic of much discussion lately, and that's just a really obvious example. The way that almost always sex scenes in mainstream movies are both boring and badly staged in a way that's just sort of uncomfortable, projects the discomfort of everyone involved making it, is another one. But if it's done right, you're a good movie, a movie that hits big, captures the gestalt, the collective, in such a way that the perspective of the storyteller, the movie, is strikes a chord in response with large audiences, sometimes in unexpected ways. So, for instance, this little black cast horror movie, Get Out, went huge last year, really huger than it deserved to. It's a pretty solid B+ movie. It was taken by the world as an A++ movie, because everyone recognized the world they live in it, I think.
Is sexism in movies, is that a concern of yours?
I think that I have some sort of mystical ideas in this area. I honestly believe that storytelling, with a capital S, storytelling full stop, is how people learn morality and ethics all around. Be it your dad telling you an anecdote, or a movie you watch, or something you heard happen to someone, or something in the Bible. Storytelling is how we learn on these abstract levels. And so I think it's the responsibility of the filmmaker to be conscious of the lessons we teach. Because if you're not, then you're creating works that teach lessons that you are not conscious of. You don't know what you're saying, literally. So I always have messages embedded in what I do, because the messages are going to be there whether you intend them to be or not. An example people talk about a lot is the fascination of the American cinema and television with gun violence, sort of creating a feedback loop with real-world gun violence, and nobody's real solid on the connection there. There's not a clear negative influence from the cinema on the apparently endless people going crazy and shooting people, but there's clearly a connection. All of us can see that. I think movies tend to teach very strange lessons about dating and romance and sex, as well as violence. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm, like I said, it's sort of a mystical, sort of religious thing with me, this idea that storytellers are always teachers.
Yeah. So take us back. How do you initially get into screenwriting?
Well, I was really into writing from a young age. I was writing as soon as I knew how to hold a pen and put words together. So I always knew I was going to be some kind of a writer, some kind of a professional storyteller. When I was 11 or 12, I started making a close and careful and concerted study of the cinema. Somewhere in my mid-teens, I figured out that screenwriting is central and key. Most of the best filmmakers are producer-directors who write their own scripts. clearly writing is a good way to step up to directing and producing. And you can learn how to do it at home mostly. I trained myself almost entirely. I did go to film school, but I never took any formal screenwriting classes. I had good mentors. I should mention S.P. Somtow was a huge influence on me when I was a teenager. Spent maybe 100 hours talking to me about screenwriting, telling me which books to read, sending me scripts to look at, looking at my work and telling me what my grossest errors were when I was 15 or 16 was very important to me. When I went to Emerson College in 1989, like I said, I never took a screenwriting class. I didn't stay in college long enough. I dropped out after a year, but they had a really extensive library of actual shooting scripts at the college, at Emerson College on Beacon Street, and I spent a lot of time reading scripts for movies I loved, reading scripts that I'd seen used as examples of great screenwriting in the textbooks.
Well, what kind of books, what kind of screenplays specifically are you reading back in those days?
Well, Sid Field, of course, was really central then. There were a couple of other textbooks that were close to being just as important, but Sid Field was really important. Though anyone who's a professional filmmaker will tell you Sid Field and the other guys who wrote the great textbooks, you read them for ideas about character and structure and storytelling. You have to actually study real shooting scripts to see how they're written. It's very technical stuff, and you have to work with real filmmakers to put the finishing touches on your act as a screenwriter. But the movie that made me want to be a screenwriter specifically was Buckaroo Banzai. It came out when I was in 8th grade. I was really passionate about that movie. It's, of course, beautifully written. I vividly remember when I was 18 in college getting a hold of the shooting script for Buckaroo Banzai and reading it 2 or 3 times really closely. It's a great script. Actually, most of the dialogue is different from the dialogue in the finished movie. It took me half of the script the first time around to figure out that was because they had the writer on set. They did a lot of workshopping and improvising. They had great actors, and they were all very funny. Which is another thing about screenwriting. It's not the finished movie often has very little to do with the script that was written. Influences. In my late teens, I became really obsessed with, I guess, a kind of golden age in screenwriting in the 30s and 40s. The Howard Hawks movies, the Preston Sturges movies, stuff Ben Hecht wrote for Howard Hawks. Just amazing dialogue in those movies. Of course, the script for Casablanca is well known to be brilliant. The way that screenplays used to shimmer with sparkling wit whenever they were not busy doing something else, I think is sadly a lost art. And the actors agree. You talk to Hollywood actors regularly, and they're collectively pretty sad that dialogue is now a matter of simple, straightforward stuff. Doesn't give actors much to work with or chew on or make award-winning performances out of.
Maybe that's where I went wrong. I remember perusing the back pages of Premiere magazine, looking for shooting scripts by the Coen brothers, Michael Mann, Alan Parker, only to wind up paying $45 worth of allowance and grass-cutting money for a Steven Seagal out for just a shooting script. Yeah, one of the things I heard a lot when I moved to LA was if you want to learn how to write professional screenplay, go to Hollywood Book and Poster and pick up a random armload of actual shooting scripts of episodic TV and TV movies. Don't pick out the scripts by the best writers, because the guys who make big budget stuff with established reputations can break the rules as they want to. I have a vivid memory of 94, 95. I was in Los Angeles and taking my first screenwriting gigs. I was sitting in a producer's office, and this is probably how it works for everyone. I did 2 or 3 jobs for free, and then 2 or 3 jobs for minimal pay, and in return I was trained closely by producers in how to get certain things exactly right so stuff could be shot. I was sitting in a producer's office one day, and we were talking about the length of scripts. You're sort of
told you must stick to a page-a-minute format. A full-length script for a movie should basically be 100 pages long. I'm sure this wisdom is different now, actually, because the movies tend to be longer now, especially the A-list stuff. But so we have this conversation. Movies should be 100 pages. No more. Maybe 105. And then the guy has to take a call, and he points to a pile of scripts on the desk, and he says, this is a bunch of the stuff that's up for awards this season. It's about to go into production. Take a look. So he walks out, and I spend half an hour sitting there. The script for Quiz Show, the Robert Redford movie, it's 170 pages long. 170 pages long. The script for Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau was sitting there. I ended up reading 40 or 50 pages of it because I love that novel. That script was 160 pages long. And the producer came back in, and I said, well, what's with you saying I got to write 100-page scripts? But all of these are ridiculously long compared to that. And he said, well, these are established producers. They can do things how they want. And those two examples, actually, it's clear, Quiz Show is very talky, very, very talky. A lot of talking, and it's pretty long. And Island of Dr. Moreau turned into a train wreck in the editing room, in part because the script was too long. So, common wisdom is common for a reason, I guess. But yeah, the guys who make the big movies, they can do things the way they want, and break the rules. They're the guys who made the rules usually, originally when they were young. The script for Attic Expeditions actually was ridiculously long, and that was by design. The script that we ended up shooting was, I think before we played formatting tricks, it was 145 pages long. And Jeremy, who directed it, was pretty set on going with a script that was too long, with the somewhat flawed reasoning that having too much script was like having too much coverage. It gave you more room to throw stuff out for performance reasons, etc., etc. The upshot of that for Attic is that you can sense that big chunks of the movie are missing. It feels like you're seeing highlights of a much longer movie sometimes.
Now, you've lived a very diverse life, geographically speaking, having lived in a number of interesting places across the country, such as Massachusetts, Alaska, California, Wyoming, Mississippi, Florida. How has living in all these places informed your screenwriting?
Well, I don't. It wasn't. It certainly hasn't been by design that I've lived in 7 or 8 different states. I guess I might have picked it up from my parents. So they both settled down by the time I started moving around. It's. It wasn't meant to be that way, but I think it is. It's really good for any writer, any storyteller to move around a lot, because you get a grip on which elements of society and character are immutable, and which things change from place to place. You get a close grip on the kinds of things you need to research so that you won't unconsciously express. I mean, for example, I see movies all the time that take place in small towns, somewhere rural and colorful, somewhere in the South or the West, and you can tell the filmmakers have never lived in a small town from all kinds of context clues within the story. How could that character possibly live in that small town with that other character and not know that he went to jail 10 years ago? They live in the same town. There's 500 people there. If you've never lived in a small town, you wouldn't know that kind of thing works that way, for example. I think it's important to a writer to have those experiences if you get the chance. I sort of made the chance. When I'm not writing, I work minimum wage jobs in food and retail, and you can do that anywhere if you're not trying to move up to management. So that makes it easy to move around a lot if you want to, if you don't want to bring a lot of stuff with you.
Does that sort of open up your time to where you can concentrate, focus on your screenwriting? Is that by design?
It certainly was 15, 20 years ago. I went through a long phase of bad health. I have a medical condition called ankylosing spondylitis. If you look me up and look around, it looks like there's sort of 7 or 8 year dropout for most of the zeros and the ones. It's because my health was wrecked. I finally got on decent insurance when I got married in 2008. Spent several years nailing down what's wrong with me, figuring out how to treat it. It's fairly stable now. But before that, and before Attic Expeditions in 2001, it was certainly by design. There was a period of 3 or 4 years when I lived in Mississippi and worked part-time jobs to pay the bills, and the screenwriting money, when it did come in, was a bonus check, and I could afford to travel back and forth to Los Angeles. The bills for running a household were insanely cheap compared to any urban setting in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I think I just started doing this again a year and a half ago. I'm delivering pizzas right now and slowly pulling it together to go back to Los Angeles and get back to work as a screenwriter and a filmmaker. Might make some movies here locally in Tampa because it looks like it's a good idea, but it's much harder now to make ends meet and get slightly ahead on part-time hours doing anything for an hourly wage. It's just... everything's gotten slightly more expensive, and the wages have stagnated. You feel it if you're actually living on minimum wage. I have to work 40 hours a week now. 15, 20 years ago, I could work 25 hours a week, and that left plenty of time for writing. It's a good deal more of a struggle now. And that's not the easy way to do it. I mean, there's a reason that most of the people who get into filmmaking and most of the people who are professional writers are comfortably upper middle class, and most of them have families who understand what they're trying to do, because it's what Virginia Woolf described as having a room of your own. You have to have enough room to develop artistically and to develop an act as an artist, and that requires the proverbial 10,000 hours. You have to find some way to schedule those 10,000 hours. If you're working 40, 50 hours a week at the pizza place, it's a little harder.
So I'm visualizing a suicidal post-Calvinist Paul Schrader in his cramped New York apartment banging out the script to Taxi Driver. Do you think this conflict between screenwriting and the daily struggle of work life and trying to pay the bills adds an edge or authenticity to your work that maybe is missing from someone employed in a comfortable staff writing position, maybe?
Yeah. Well, it seems to be, like I said, most of the filmmakers are what we poor kids call rich kids. But they are singularly driven, because if you're comfortable, you have to have some kind of need to not be comfortable, to step outside of what you could just relax, but you're not. You're working up an act as a filmmaker. It's not an easy thing to do. It's hard work on the slowest day. But those of us who come from less advantaged backgrounds, are more driven, and you meet people a lot who are near filmmaking money people who you see this lack of need to work to live in their personality. It's like they're under a blanket their whole lives in some way. It's hard to explain. Certain emotions are muted, and you can see that it's not quite comfortable. Probably not as uncomfortable as living on the edge of starvation and worrying about how you're going to pay to get your teeth fixed, but maybe some kind of discomfort is necessary to make good art. Maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of where the struggling artist term comes from, because you're living a life. I mean, you're experiencing the raw emotions, the struggle, the conflict. You're meeting people every day. You're having to figure out, juggle bills and things like that. And that's got to inform writing, on a much more human, personal level than someone who's, working for the studio as a staff writer, who's not necessarily where his paycheck's coming from,
Yeah, it's sort of, have you ever seen the Preston Sturges movie, Sullivan's Travels? That's sort of what that's about. The Joel McCrea plays a director in the movie who's known for sort of tacky romantic sex comedies, and he wants to make a serious movie. And sort of the point of the movie is, because he's a rich kid, he doesn't know serious. He just has no idea. He wants to make sort of a socially conscious movie about the plight of the common man, and he doesn't know shit about it. He's never been the common man. So, and the entire cinema sort of has that issue. That there's a disconnect from real world concerns. The Academy picks out the 5 movies every year that actually do address real world concerns and honors them, but I don't think they make much money. Because another part of the point of Sullivan's Travels is that mass audience, the huddled masses struggling and suffering that the director wants to illuminate the struggles of. They like the dumb comedies. They want escapism because their lives are rough. They don't need to hear stories about how rough their lives are. They know. They live there. I've always found that. And of course you can do both. I mean, you can make movies that illuminate the human condition and are also great, fun trash. It's sort of the Stanley Kubrick trick, I guess. A lot of the best movies sort of work that way.
Hey, true crime fans! Do you remember what sparked your interest in true crime? For many of us, it was watching TV shows we shouldn't have been watching as children. Whether you snuck around your parents, or they played them for you at the dinner table, we all remember the shows about murder, aliens, and ghosts that captured our attention and kept us up at night.
That's why we think you will love our new podcast, Perhaps It's You, a podcast where we rewatch the show that started it all for us, Unsolved Mysteries.
I'm Liz.
And I'm Samantha.
And we were a couple of weird kids who grew into a couple of weird adults. Each week, we rewatch a classic Robert Stack episode on Amazon Prime.
Follow along with us as we recap each mystery and chat about what was scary, funny, or just plain ridiculous. We rate each episode out of Robert Stacks.
I give our podcast 5 out of 5 Robert Stacks.
And pick our favorite mustache.
Find our podcast on iTunes and Google Play.
Perhaps people will love our podcast.
Perhaps it's you!
What's more important to your screenwriting, character or plot?
It depends on the script and the project. The original screenplays I've wrote that work the way you're talking about, you develop an entire story from scratch to a finished script. With maybe 1 or 2 exceptions that were practice that nobody ever really read, I was always working with producers and directors. I did write a couple of original scripts on spec back when I was learning, but they weren't really good enough to sell. Everything I've written that was on a professional level started with the filmmakers. The Attic Expeditions and Freezer Burn were both written with the director in mind, and following a series of conversations with the director, running ideas past her in the case of Freezer Burn, and figuring out what they would like, what they would enjoy working with. You write the song for the singer. In fact, I'm not really sure how I would approach writing an original script just from scratch. When I started thinking about directing and producing stuff a couple of years ago, I decided to work with other writers and not use original scripts of my own. I'm also pretty fascinated with adapting novels to the screen. For me, screenwriting, the joy in it and what I'm good at is all about structure and multiple level readings. I like things to work on multiple levels in complicated sort of post-psychedelic ways. It's the parts that are actually about character and story in ways that captivate audiences. That to me is secondary. So I've always tried to work with a text to adapt when I'm working on my own, or another writer. I've collaborated either with a director on or another writer on pretty much everything. But it's sort of, I guess the direct answer is it starts as sort of a general concept. Attic Expeditions started as, Jeremy was, I think, 21 or 22, and his first job in Los Angeles, he was an office assistant on a movie called Witchcraft 4, which starred Julie Strain, and they were having people work for free. He ended up getting promoted to associate producer really quickly, and their writer was something like a month overdue on their script, and he called me at home in Mississippi and told me if I could write a movie that sort of fit those parameters very, very quickly, then maybe he could get them to buy my script and use it instead of the script they'd already commissioned from a real writer. I just had to write something that had a witch in it, some witchcraft, a specific house for a location. So that's how Attic Expeditions started. And I knew that it was going to be a low-budget horror movie, probably badly directed and badly acted, and so I was writing into those expectations. Freeze or Burn had the core starting impetus, I guess is a better word, that Melissa, who directed it, her mother could arrange financing for something for herself to star in, a low-budget art film for her to star in, and she had deeply strange taste in movies. She wanted something kind of radical and arty that would do well at festivals, and that was the parameters for that. Writing a vehicle for someone to act in who's really never done any acting was, it was cool. It was fun. I don't know what I would write if they just said write whatever you want. If it's good, we'll go make the movie. I'm not sure what I would do. It'd probably be a horror movie, but other than that, I'm not sure.
The Attic Expeditions as a screenplay is fairly non-linear. However, are there any aspects of screenplay structure that you pay importance to?
Yes and no. I make a close and ongoing study of timing in storytelling. I think that sort of matters more than any strict ideas about structure and character, is that things move forward in certain ways every 10 or 15 minutes. You can't set out to not satisfy the audience unless you can satisfy them in some unexpected way. Tarantino's a good example of that. His movies are often disappointing in traditional terms. When he made Pulp Fiction, just the endless sort of chatty dialogue that is just sort of like real people talking was really radical, and I'm sure it looked crazy on paper. But then you get Sam Jackson and John Travolta to do that dialogue. It works great. And there's you come up against odd things with certain stories you want to tell in certain ways you want to tell them. Attic Expeditions has that very strange psychedelic sort of looping structure, and the ending that loops back around. It's sort of a drug joke, but it also has the precedent of that's how they did it on Twilight Zone, basically. That kind of trick ending is something you can do in horror movies. You can also leave your hero in a terrible place in a horror movie, like Attic Expeditions did. You can't always do that. It is funny the conversations you have about writing projects that are based on this kind of... one script I worked on, I think we argued for 2 hours a night for 3 weeks as to whether the guy should end up with the girl at the end or not. There's a pretty complicated argument on either side in terms of storytelling and effect. Yeah, movies can change those rules slightly as things become successful and make it clear that the audience will take things in certain ways. It's, for instance, become fashionable lately for horror movies to be thoughtful and quiet and not overwhelmed with violence and special effects. That was certainly not something that you could sell easy 20 years ago. In fact, you couldn't sell horror easily at all 20 years ago. I kept hearing that the kids hated anything with supernatural elements, monsters and space and stuff. And in the mid-90s, the common wisdom was nobody wanted to see that stuff, which is amazing now. Yeah. And I mean, like one I struggle with lately as a writer. I really like science fiction and fantasy. I really like the way that CG has opened up opportunities and possibilities. But what the possibility I see is that you can make really interesting small movies aimed at smart niche audiences that have elaborate special effects in them that are advanced science fiction and fantasy storytelling. But the cinema collectively is pretty dead set on seeing this stuff as spectacular shows for children. And you can see a lot of filmmakers pushing towards doing smarter, more literary, lower budget stuff in those genres. The Cloverfield sequel is a good example. But the movies I want to write, I can't write quite yet. Maybe another 10 years, hopefully. And in that instance, it's hard not to think it's intrinsic. When you lead people to believe they're going to see aliens and spaceships and monsters, there are certain expectations. Well, Attic Expeditions, people who are deeply disappointed in that movie, there's a lot of people who saw it who just did not like being confused and left confused. They didn't like that it's vague. Which we knew going in, but one that I've always been kind of taken aback by is the horror core audience. Sometimes, if you make a movie that's really a comedy, that uses horror stuff, but is genuinely a comedy with horror trappings, there's a segment of the horror audience that hates that. They feel they've been bamboozled. That horror movies are supposed to scare you in certain ways. They're not supposed to be just unsettling and funny. And there's there's no way to answer that really. They're right for them. It's not the movie for them, but every genre has expectations, and if you explode them, you better have good reasons and know what you're doing. Yeah.
How well do you know your characters and plot before sitting down to write a screenplay?
Characters are. Yeah, I know the characters really well when I start writing, usually. Sometimes with supporting characters, I don't have a grip on them right away, and usually what I do is pick a friend or an actor or a specific actor's performance to model on, and within a few pages, that character has its own life. But I mean, and it isn't even really, I've written roles for dead actors a bunch of times. I think I've written roles that were Ricky Nelson in Rio Bravo twice. I write roles for Walter Brennan all the time. Because, I mean, it doesn't matter if you can get Walter Brennan. It's just a good way to get a grip on the kind of character you're writing for that kind of character. Storytelling, I tend to have a fairly detailed outline, and I tend to intentionally go long. Like I'll have a 5 or 10 page outline that is a 5-act structure, and then somewhere in the middle I will realize that most of what I saw as Act 3 or Act 4 is just not at all necessary, and I'll throw out half of what I thought would be the second half of the movie. It's another problem with Hollywood screenwriting is now they've reduced it to a science. They shepherd these beat outlines through draft after draft until they're sure it works as an outline, but that leaves the actual writer no room for maybe improvisation isn't the right word, but you have to be sort of freewheeling in your creativity. It's like playing music and having to stick to the music on the sheet as opposed to improvising. You somehow leach the blood out of the storytelling that way, and you can sense in the finished writing a lot that it's like that. Doesn't feel like there's actually a writer on a lot of the big movies now. You can sense that it was a team that put the script together, for better or for worse, and it's usually for worse.
How important is it to meet audience and genre expectations in a screenplay?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it was Alexander Pope maybe used the phrase continuous slight novelty to describe what good storytelling does, and I think Hollywood aims for that a lot. It's supposed to just be a little bit unfamiliar, just be a little bit new, and when it's nailed, it works fairly well. I mean, I guess Star Wars and Die Hard are both really good examples of that. And on the other hand, not. They were leaps forward in important ways. Yeah, and I think the audience is trained now, at least the larger part of the movie audience, even the smart ones are sort of, when you show them something unexpected, they seem to misunderstand it as being incorrect. A recent example I can think of is Alien Covenant, which every smart horror and science fiction geek I know kind of hated. And I thought it was pretty good. I sat through it easily. And one of the reasons was what you're talking about, the way that story moves. Now, granted, it was clearly a bunch of complicated stuff setting up more sequels, but it was unexpected stuff. I did not expect most of what happened in that movie, other than the stuff that was just remaking the original Alien. It seems like somehow people just didn't like that. Didn't like that the second half of that movie gets strange and is about robot people and stuff that has nothing to do with the aliens.
Do you find that audiences are more sophisticated now?
I think they're less sophisticated, actually. I'm not sure why. It seems to have something to do with the way that the internet creates a pressure to agree that was always there, agree critically, that we who are smart and cool like all the same things and hate all the same things, that was always there. But the way the internet sort of seizes up its opinion of things does not lend itself to the cult following. Well, for instance, I mentioned earlier Sucker Punch is one of my favorite movies of the last 10 or 15 years, and I don't think I've met someone else yet who liked it at all. But I know a lot of people who heard it was terrible and haven't seen it. It's just sort of the common wisdom. It's a lousy movie. It's, you know, these days it's always the Howard the Duck effect when a movie is hated. Another one that's like that is that guy, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Yue Boll, who makes the straight-to-video vampire movies. He made In the Name of the King. His movies are fun garbage. They're really fun, and he makes them look like they're much more expensive than they are. It's definitely trash. It's fun trash. But the internet, I don't know how that guy's still walking around trying to make movies. I would be crushed by the depression fostered by the climate for my name and work on the internet if I was him.
How has the advancement in digital technology and the so-called democratization of filmmaking affected the independent film industry, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to get anything going now that's not a sequel or a remake, and it's kind of sad, actually. And you see, well, for instance, David Lynch couldn't get anything financed for 10 or 15 years, and his now career bookending masterpiece is season 3 of Twin Peaks. That's how he got them to finance David Lynch being David Lynch on the highest possible level. He told them it was Twin Peaks 3. Sam Raimi kept, I could tell tales out of class about studio interference with those Spider-Man movies that would chill you to the bone, but he pretty much had to walk away because they wouldn't let him make movies that worked the right way for him, and made a couple of other small movies, and then finally backed all the way into doing an Evil Dead show for TV. He gets creative freedom, and he does what he's good at, but it's Evil Dead number something. It's still a sequel. It's still a reboot. It's a shame, really. It's really a shame. But then again, the cinema's always been prone to sequels and adaptations and reboots and remakes. It's just the bigger the budgets are, the higher the stakes are. Now there's this world we made Attic Expeditions in, where we set out to make a $100,000 movie, and the machine handed us more money and better actors, and it did well at festivals and did well on video and broke even. Percentages paid out a little bit. That is almost impossible to do now. The low budget stuff that's breaking through and making a mark now is much lower budget. Maybe not in terms of numbers, but in terms of their actual resources. You know, the Witch is interesting, the Babadook is interesting, but they don't have Alice Cooper in them. They're much more straight-laced productions. They have less money and less resources. I know several really good filmmakers who haven't done anything for a while. Jim Van Beber, for instance, he made his Manson movie in 2005, and the market changed in such a way that if you're the Orson Welles of underground filmmaking, as he is, you have to figure out a way to make a movie for less than $50,000 and pay yourself to do it. That's just the way the market has changed. And you know, he had a lot more money than that on Manson. It's just not the world we live in now. Yeah.
How well did the casting of the Attic Expeditions match up with your idea of the characters in your original screenplay?
I think the casting's great. The acting's a little uneven because Jeremy's the kind of director, it's that way with him. But I don't think we could have done better than we did. Jeffrey Combs was my idea. Alice Cooper was my idea. Ted Raimi, I think the casting directors came up with him, but he, of course, is always great. He's a really fun guy to hang out with. Seth had been in movies since he was 8 or 9 years old, and Attic was the last low-budget thing he did before he was suddenly a well-paid comic actor for many years. Our first script reading, the drinking wine and everyone sits around and reads the script out loud party, was the weekend the first Austin Powers movie opened. The whole time we were making Attic Expedition, Seth kept telling us his agent was begging him to just tear up the deal memo and walk away. But he really liked the script. And you can see why. I don't know that he's gotten to do any more sort of character roles like that since then. Maybe Party Monster. It's certainly more fun to act in Attic Expeditions than to act in badly written comedies and dignify them with your talent. And that was the role I wrote for myself. Seth is a better actor than me in almost every way that counts, so I was definitely happy with that. Andras in the lead, I really like him. I really like the guy personally. We were friends for a long time after the show and have talked about working on other stuff together. His performance is really uneven because he didn't get along with Jeremy well, and it was a difficult role. Wendy Roby's great. She was the casting director's idea too, and she hasn't been in much. She was in People Under the Stairs. She was in Twin Peaks. She's really good. It's if you have interesting dialogue, you can get good actors. We sort of got everyone we asked for, and other roles that we didn't. For instance, Nancy Wolfe. The old woman who reads the crazy story in the group therapy scene, who's one of the first characters to get killed, she played Sadie in Helter Skelter, the TV movie, which is super cool. She was great in that movie. She's good in Attic too. I think often you go into a low-budget movie and you have a script that doesn't have dialogue that sparkles. You're the better actors aren't going to bother to take a pay cut to do it. If they have a choice, they'll do the one with the more interesting dialogue. Yeah, I guess we lucked out that way. I don't know if it's luck. I made a point of writing good dialogue. But yeah, I was totally happy with the casting. I wish Jeremy was a little sharper a director with the actors, but you know, maybe I'll be working with a better director when I write the sequel or whatever.
Speaking of cast, you make an acting appearance in Addicts as well, don't you?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was sort of a consolation prize that I got to play that role after getting booted from one of the leads because we got Seth Green. But it was really fun. I'm pretty uneven in it. I'm only in 3 or 4 little scenes, and they happen real fast, back to back. But at least 2 of those times I was busy directing a B unit and had to walk over to the other side of the set and do a scene real quick, and I wasn't concentrating right. It's fun to get my face bashed in with the typewriter. That I love doing stunts. Acting is you know, acting when you're shooting 35 and you have a real budget is really tense. If you screw up a take, everyone makes you feel how much money got spent on that. It's high tension work, acting on SAG gigs. I think it might be easier than writing, maybe. It's hard to say.
Do you have plans to return to screenwriting at some point in the future?
Well, where I stand right now, as we do this interview, I've been living in Tampa since I got divorced a couple years ago, and I've been sort of gathering myself to get back into filmmaking. I would very much like to make low-budget underground movies here in Tampa because I think it's a quicker path to actually making good movies. The amount of money you can make movies for is utterly ridiculous now. I acted in one of Byro's movies a couple years ago, American Guinea Pig, and I think his final actual budget was $14,000 for that whole feature, and they shot on film. They shot on Super 8, but still. But that's sort of the model you have to do as an underground filmmaker now. Now, I also know people in Hollywood, so I haven't really moved forward with trying to make any movies in Tampa because maybe there's a model that brings in actors from LA but uses local cast and crew and resources and what they cost here rather than this multiple union predicated structure imposed on your production in Los Angeles, which means that the starting bet at that table is $500,000 now, maybe $250,000 maybe, and then you don't get any recognizable actors. Here in Tampa, if I make a feature, I could make a feature for $5,000 or $10,000 here, and still pay people $50 a day and feed them. It's just the equipment is that much cheaper, and there are professional level filmmakers making underground stuff here, and that's probably true in every sizable city in the country now, that there are film school bred filmmakers who are doing stuff that looks just as slick as finished TV everywhere now. But, you know, the acting is off, the writing is off, but that's a very strange model. And as far as making money screenwriting, I hope to be able to sell a script or two in the next while and use that money to finance the free time I will need to develop a project as a director. But I don't expect it to be like hitting the lottery. I expect to get ahead by $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 and be able to parlay that into other filmmaking ventures. You know, I guess John Sayles is one of the models for that. He sort of financed his living expenses writing Hollywood screenplays, low budget, trashy movies, and then he'd go back out to the Midwest and make these kind of brilliant, really low budget art films with unknown actors. You couldn't really do it on the scale he did it now, but yeah, I guess it's a similar. And also now, I think even with the very low budget stuff, you have to have a concept or a set of concepts that breaks through the chatter. There is way too much competition in the low budget market. You could do something brilliant that is basically people standing around talking, and I don't think people would notice. It is like the early 70s in that the way to get everyone's attention is to shock them, but how to shock the audience that is as jaded as we are now. I'm a big admirer of the human centipede, and that's sort of what you have to do now. You have to come up with a concept that is dramatic and memorable as a punch in the face, basically. If you want to make underground filmmaking, it's pretty severe limitation in a lot of ways, but in other ways it's freeing.
I understand you currently have a book project in the works. Share a little about that.
I am about 2 hours of just proofreading away from finishing the manuscript, which is a collection of slightly rewritten interviews and reviews I did for a bunch of publications, Film Thread, Alternative Cinema. It's sort of, I think it's pretty fun. The reason I'm doing it is to raise a few $100s so I can go back to LA and get ahead of the delivering pizza minimum wage, paying the bills grind. But it's going to be a good book. When I was a regularly publishing critic, on my best days, I aspired to be like Lester Bangs or Hunter Thompson, and it's full of very funny stuff. It's called Burn Before Reading, which is a title I got from a horror writer named David Price. And to give credit where credit is due. And I'm going to do it with CreateSpace. The manuscript, if I can find the time, I'll finish it tonight, and I'll launch it as soon as CreateSpace allows, which I understand is more or less instantaneous, given that you got to format your own material. I'm also sort of using it to test Facebook as marketing, because I plan to not, at least at first, I'm not going to promote it in any way except to talk about it on my Facebook page. I'm curious to see how that will work. I have this idea that a lot of the stuff my friends who are authors do to promote their books on various different websites is basically redundant and useless, that you're already your Facebook page is your best marketing tool, and the other ones are sort of dismissible. But yeah, it's mainly to get my hand back in as a writer. I have a couple of screenwriting projects I'm supposed to be working on after that stuff. People want me to develop. I think I have a hit script to write. I can't really talk about the idea for yet. It's a good position to be in, I guess. I just got to make the time to do the writing, which time gets more and more expensive every year. So, but we'll see how that goes. The book should be out within a few weeks. I should do what Stephen Byro always does. I should just use this to announce a date that's a little bit too close, and then aim for it like it's homework for a class. That's Stephen Byro's method. He'll tell you his movie is going to be out in April and January, and then everybody has to scramble to make the movie real quick. It works great for him. Yeah, whatever hoops I have to jump through to arrange the design and formatting is really all that's left to do. Burn before reading. Yeah, look for it in a month. I just did it. I gave myself a deadline. Yeah. It'll be out in a month. How's that? What's the date today? Yep. By the end of November. That's even closer.
So maybe ready in time just for Christmas, right?
This is the season for book selling, for sure. And for book buying. Yeah. And then I can be an author also, which strangely, as a screenwriter, there's this weird thing where novelists look up to screenwriters and screenwriters look up to novelists. They are in their own ways each higher up on the ladder of professional storytelling. There's no prestige in screenwriting, but there's much better money.
And that's the Attic Expedition screenwriter Rogan Russell Marshall. Be on the lookout for his book, Burn Before Reading, which, as he has mentioned today, will be out before Christmas. So maybe pick up a copy as a gift for yourself or someone. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Rogan.
Sure, man. I'm always happy to talk about myself like most writers. Thanks a lot for having me.
And that does it for another episode of Second Acts. I want to thank Rogan Russell Marshall again for stopping by the show, as well as you, the listeners, for tuning in for yet another episode. Musical credit goes to Mikey Moratini, as always. If you enjoy our show, why not share us on Facebook with your family and friends, as well as give us a rating on iTunes. As Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, there are no second acts in American lives, but there are on Second Acts Podcast. See you next time.
Hi, this is Sean Riley, host of Second Acts Podcast. I'm not just a podcast host, but I'm also the director of the feature film Fighting Belle. Fighting Belle is a romantic comedy best described as Legally Blonde meets Rocky with a dash of Sweet Home Alabama thrown into the mix. When a sassy Southern belle is jilted at the altar by her fighter fiancé, she trains as a boxer to get her revenge. Don't miss what movie reviewer Toxic Flitch describes as a southern fried romantic comedy with a distinctly different approach to finding love. And the movie critic next door writes, warm southern charm and ice-cold revenge that somehow works beautifully. Be sure to rent or own Fighting Bell today on Amazon Video.